welcome to this edition of Head to Head. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and this is episode number 308 of the podcast. And on this episode, I'm talking about college basketball head coach John Calipari leaving the Kentucky Wildcats. For decades now, one of the most polarizing figures in college sports has been John Calipari. He's someone who provokes strong opinions and since 2009 has been the head coach of the Kentucky Wildcats. That is until now. Calipari has left Kentucky and is now the head coach of Arkansas. Before I talk about the breakup between Coach Cal and Kentucky, I want to talk about why he's a figure I find fascinating. I first noticed him when he was the head coach of Memphis, where he led them to a trip to the NCAA championship game, and that team had star guard Derrick Rose, one of the most electric players in my lifetime. I know now he's thought of as an injury-riddled star, but man, at the time, in his college career, he was the most exciting player in the nation. And then while at Kentucky, Calipari became synonymous with coaching star players. Point guard John Wall, big man DeMarcus Cousins, star forward Anthony Davis, point guard De'Aaron Fox, center Bam Adebayo, shooting guard Devin Booker, another big man in Karl Anthony Towns, Julius Randle, Jamal Murray, Tyrese Maxey, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, and Tyler Hero. There were and are currently some of the best players in the NBA. I mean, if you put a Kentucky All-Star team together, they could beat the East and the West combined. In total, Calipari has sent 58 players to the NBA. That's the most ever for a college coach. He's one of the coaches that made the term one and done famous for both good and bad. And people look at his time in Kentucky and ask themselves, why did he only win one championship? And I think that's fair to ask. But the one and done, I think, is the big reason why his teams didn't win more. They were uber talented. They had superstar players, but they didn't play college basketball beyond their freshman years. His teams had endless amounts of talent, but their inexperience at times made them undisciplined. I mean, we could really look back and ask ourselves, what is the success rate of a one-and-done superstar winning an NCAA championship? I mean, you have Anthony Davis. He had that amazing season with the Kentucky Wildcats, but then there are so many others that didn't win. For as good as Zion was in college, he didn't win an NCAA tournament with Duke. Carmelo Anthony did win with Syracuse, but we're talking about an all-time great basketball player. I mean, Carmelo Anthony was a Hall of Fame player. The one-and-dones have not been as successful as people make it seem. The guys who historically win in college basketball are the ones who play into their junior and senior years. Christian Laettner at Duke, those are the ones we remember because they had a long run. I mean, it's stating the obvious, but it's worth saying that all of these players that played with Calipari with Kentucky have played way better in the NBA. I mean, Devin Booker is way better than he was in college. They were so young, they were inexperienced, they were talented, but they weren't there yet. Here's what John Calipari himself talked about the current state of college basketball and why the one-and-dones aren't winning. Quote, all of a sudden, it's gotten really old. So we're playing teams and our average age is 19. Their average age is 24 and 25. So do I now change because of that? Maybe add a couple of older guys to supplement? I personally am in favor of them getting rid of the one and done. I don't think it's helping college basketball anymore. At first, it was really cool to see Derrick Rose and Anthony Davis play college basketball when they wouldn't have. But now it's really hurting the sport. There are not star players, and I think people are realizing that the one and dones are not having the success in the tournament we all thought they were going to have. I think if you're going to play college basketball, you should at least play 2 seasons. And I do think you should come out of high school straight to the NBA if that's what you want to do. But if you enter college basketball, you should at least play 2 seasons. I do think it's really interesting that John Calipari is being a little bit self-aware here and looking back at his time in Kentucky and asking himself, maybe I shouldn't have gone all in on the one and dones. Maybe I only should have had one and done at a time. Because again, he was stacking his roster with all of these guys guys. John Wall and DeMarcus Cousins played together at Kentucky. Maybe your two best players shouldn't both be one-and-done stars. I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, and I find it interesting that he's looking at it that way as well. But it was undeniably the narrative around that school. It's why people were fascinated by them. Oh, they've assembled this team of star players who are only going to play college basketball for one season. But I do think that interest worn off at the end. I think we all got used to what Kentucky is and how far they can go with this model, and the fact that they needed to get a legendary star like Anthony Davis in order to win an NCAA tournament. I think at one point we all thought, well, John Calipari is just going to win forever because he's got these one-and-dones. Man, did we realize we were wrong. A lot has been made recently about the fact that for the first time ever, women's college basketball was more popular than men's college basketball. And yes, most of that is because of Caitlin Clark. And the men were missing a phenom. I think another reason for the decline interest in men's college basketball is the loss of larger-than-life coaches. People cared about Coach K, Jim Boeheim, Tom Izzo, Rick Pitino, Calipari, and now all of these coaches are either retired or in the decline. And I know it now has Dan Hurley at UConn, and he's interesting, but he's not enough. Men's college basketball definitely needs more star power in coaching positions. That has always been the foundation of college basketball, from John Wooden, Dean Smith, John Thompson. The list goes on and on. When college basketball is at its best, it has interesting head coaches leading marquee schools. For instance, I am somebody who does not regularly follow college basketball, but I would watch Duke every once in a while, and I would pay attention to where they are because I was interested in Coach K. I believe the hype around that guy. He was a star in his own right. He was coaching Team USA. We all thought he would have made an excellent coach in the NBA. Who is that guy right now in the NBA? There isn't that guy with that cachet. Calipari, when it was going right for him with Kentucky, had that cachet. We all thought he would make the jump to the NBA. I still don't understand why he never made the jump to the NBA. Why isn't he the head coach of the Phoenix Suns coaching Devin Booker? Or why isn't he the head coach of the Knicks coaching Julius Randle? I find it kind of interesting that he never made that jump to the NBA and coached one of his former Kentucky stars, because they are filled without the NBA. I mean, John Calipari making the jump to the NBA and bringing like 3 of his Kentucky stars with him to an NBA franchise, that's a really interesting storyline that never happened for whatever reason. It's true that his stint in the NBA with the Nets was a disaster, but there have been college coaches who made the jump to the NBA and have had success recently. Brad Stevens with the Boston Celtics. I think Billy Donovan with OKC in Chicago has been good. He hasn't been great, but he's been very good. Calipari had signed a lifetime contract to remain Kentucky's head coach, but we all know that means absolutely nothing. I think this is a good thing for both sides, but this is the end of an era, and Calipari, despite coaching all of those star players, was the most talked about thing about Kentucky basketball. For good or for bad, we talked about him and them because he was the bad guy. I mean, looking back on it, they were the super team of college basketball, and we also had the big 3 of Chris Bosh, Dwayne Wade, and LeBron James in Miami. I mean, those were the teams that we were all rooting against. We didn't want the Miami Heat to win an NBA championship, and we didn't want the Kentucky Wildcats to win an NCAA tournament. And both teams did win in 2012. The Kentucky Wildcats won the NCAA tournament in 2012, and the Miami Heat won the NBA championship in 2012 as well. Those two teams were the villains of basketball. But the problem for Kentucky is they couldn't remain the villains because they weren't having the same success. They missed the NCAA tournament entirely in 2021, and they haven't made a Final Four appearance since 2015. That's why John Calipari is no longer the head coach of Kentucky, because they were no longer culturally relevant. We all knew that they were going to come up short in the NCAA tournament. We all knew what kind of basketball team they were going to be throughout the season. They would have spurts of being really good and being a talented group, but then by the end, they were beginning to fall apart at the seams. And it's worth noting that Duke was starting to get better one-and-done players than Kentucky. I mean, Duke in recent years had Zion Williamson, they had Jason Tatum, they had Brandon Ingram, they had Kyrie Irving, RJ Barrett. I mean, Coach K was kind of beating John Calipari at his own game. And Kentucky is one of those schools where you have to have success in order to maintain your status as one of the best coaches in college basketball. I mean, they've had Rick Pitino in the past, and they've, of course, had John Calipari, two of the best head coaches in college basketball. But when you're no longer winning at a high rate, you're going to lose your position with the team. So I think the big question here is, do you believe that John Calipari left Kentucky? I think he left on his own, but I do think that eventually, if Kentucky kept being irrelevant, they were going to be forced to fire him at some point. This is a mutual parting of ways. Even though I hate when teams say that, I really do believe that this is in the best interest of both parties. I know it's weird to say this about a college basketball team because the rosters are going to be different every season, but Kentucky needed a rebuild, and they needed a rebuild of their image because their image of John Calipari over the last 5 to 10 seasons have been him coaching young players who are not playing as well as we all thought they were going to play. And I think that that story is getting old, and nobody is really interested in that narrative anymore. Nobody's even talking about Kentucky when they underperform. We're just so used to it now. And you can tell when you watch the games that Calipari himself is sick and tired of talking about one-and-done players not reaching expectations. He felt like a guy who was sick and tired of being the head coach of Kentucky. That being said, don't think I'm going to follow him to Arkansas. I'm probably going to lose interest in John Calipari because, again, like I said earlier, I'm not that big a fan of college basketball, and one of the reasons I followed him is because of Memphis with Derrick Rose and then Kentucky with all of those star players. I don't know if star players are going to want to go to Arkansas with him, and part of me thinks that he doesn't want star players to go with him. Part of me thinks he just wants to quietly have success in his later years with Arkansas. This is a guy who's been in the spotlight for so long. He's been the head coach of Kentucky since 2009. It's 2024. That's a long time for anyone to be the head coach of a team. I personally wish that we would have gotten a chance to see him coach in the NBA again. Again, I mentioned it earlier. There are so many of his former star players in the NBA. Who wouldn't want to see Devin Booker get coached by John Calipari right now? It's not going to happen because he clearly missed his window to make that jump to the NBA. He should have made that jump about 4 years ago. One of the reasons I wanted to do a podcast about John Calipari leaving Kentucky because I don't think enough people have made a big deal about this. I do think it's a big deal. I just look around and it's crazy that Bill Belichick is no longer the head coach of the New England Patriots. Coach K is no longer the head coach at Duke. Nick Saban is no longer the head coach at Alabama. And now John Calipari is no longer the head coach of Kentucky. These guys have coached these teams for the majority of my lifetime. I don't know sports without these men coaching these institutions. I thought they were these places, and I thought they were bigger than these places. They made these places relevant for so long. And a lot of us only follow these teams because of these individuals. They are fascinating figures in the history of sports. They're beloved and hated at the same time. I think there's real similarities between all of them in their careers. And a head coach staying in one place for a really long time is more common in college. That's why Bill Belichick is the only pro coach that I mentioned on that list. But he coached NFL like he was a college coach. He coached the team like he was the face of the franchise. That's why he had issues with Tom Brady at the end, because it was his way or the highway. And I do look at the current state of sports, and I think that coaches like this are being iced out. It's not like these guys are being replaced with guys guys just like them. I think they are, for the most part, being replaced by yes men and by guys who want to be more friendly with their players. And I think that's a great thing. I think that's great. I think coaches should be friendly with the players that they coach, but you can't argue with the amount of success that these guys had and their old school coaches. Nick Saban is arguably the second best coach in college football, and by some estimations, the best coach in college football. Bill Belichick is the greatest head coach in the history of the NFL, and Coach K, for my money, is the best head coach in college basketball. There will be many listening to this podcast who will say, why are you mentioning John Calipari's name with the likes of those guys? He's nowhere near their level as a coach, and I think that's fair, but I think he's been culturally as relevant as any of those players. The media talks about this guy all of the time. He put Kentucky back on the map, and its 790 wins is the 14th most in men's college basketball history. He's also led 3 different schools to the Final Four: UMass, Memphis, and Kentucky. That's impressive. Sports fans know the name John Calipari. They followed his career even if they don't follow college basketball religiously. It's going to be weird to see Kentucky without John Calipari because he's become Kentucky in a way over the last 15 seasons. He's been the face of that franchise. He's coached so many star basketball players while there. And what I liked most about him is that people had strong opinions about John Calipari, whether or not he was good or bad for college basketball. Right now, there are so many coaches in college basketball that absolutely nobody cares about. They have no opinions on them whatsoever. That's not good for the game, because the college coaches are the ones that stay for more than 4 years, not the players anymore. That's why it's a necessity for college coaches to be stars themselves. That's why John Calipari was so integral to Kentucky, because we knew every year he was going to be there no matter what, and we knew that other young star players wanted to play for him. He had a reputation. We all knew what we were getting with John Calipari. We no longer have that in college basketball. I think that's missing. Yes, UConn has dominated the sport each of the last 2 seasons, but they have not been talked about the way that John Calipari's Kentucky team was talked about during its peak. And who knows, maybe Dan Hurley is going to reach that level of Calipari in being culturally relevant. Maybe more stars are going to want to go to UConn and be coached by him now. There's always that possibility. I just don't know if we're going to see another situation that's similar to what happened with John Calipari at Kentucky. I think right now it's easy to look at it and say we were getting sick and tired of the situation. It was going nowhere. Like, John Calipari wasn't going to have success in the future with Kentucky. It was time for them to move on. But in that same way, you can also look at it and say you're probably going to feel nostalgic about his time there in the next 5 seasons. I think you're going to reminisce about what John Calipari brought to Kentucky, because he made that team culturally relevant. He brought them Anthony Davis. He brought them John Wall. He brought them DeMarcus Cousins. He brought them Devin Booker. And it really did become a staple of the NBA draft for John Calipari to be there and see his star players in college get drafted by an NBA franchise. I mean, it's wild how many times he was there. You expected it every season when DeMarcus Cousins was drafted by the Kings, when Anthony Davis was drafted by the Pelicans, when Devin Booker was drafted by the Phoenix Suns. Who was there? John Calipari. And he knew that that was his marketing tool to get other star players to come join Kentucky, because he knew he could promise them something he could deliver, getting them to the NBA. There really has not been another figure in college basketball like John Calipari who has been so connected to the NBA. I mean, he wasn't promising them to win an NCAA championship. He was promising them a chance to become professional professional basketball players. And for the most part, it worked. Yes, should he have won another NCAA tournament or two? Absolutely. He had so much talent. But again, they were one and dones. They were young players. They always fell apart in the end. But that year that Anthony Davis won, that was the team that I followed. And it was amazing seeing Anthony Davis dominate NCAA basketball. I don't know if I'm in the majority or the minority, but I will miss John Calipari being the head coach of Kentucky. I think he made the sport more interesting, and I think the sport is desperate for more interesting figures like John Calipari. In closing, yes, I agree with everyone that college basketball needs star players, but they also need star head coaches, and that's what John Calipari was at Kentucky. He was a star head coach. Thanks for listening to this edition of Head to Head. I'm Cam McKinney, and there'll be a new episode of the podcast every Monday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, so please rate, review, and subscribe.